He was there at Shakespeare.
All right, well, welcome. My name is John Putman. I'm an associate professor of history at San Diego State. While my specialty may be the American West and modern United States, I've always been a fan of Star Trek, and recently, in the last several years, I've been able to merge that passion for Star Trek with my teaching of history, and I've actually created a course, which I've been teaching now for about 3 or 4 years, called Star Trek Culture and History. And so what you're going to see today is a little bit of kind of what I do without a lot of the history stuff, focusing more on Star Trek. But the premise of this is to kind of see how Star Trek is not only informed by the changing history of our times, but also, of course, reflects upon that in terms of the themes, the messages. Gene Roddenberry, and I'll talk about him in just a second, and some of his vision, of course, saw Star Trek as an opportunity not just to entertain, but to educate, offers thoughtful episodes that, of course, people to consider things differently. And again, science fiction is very helpful at this because it allows you to not be so overly preachy in terms of, you know, like a regular drama would be. It helps kind of reduce the barriers in the viewer so they can kind of maybe see things differently. You know, if they see it in a different species, in a different time and place, it's not as threatening, and therefore maybe the message can sink in a little bit deeper. All right, so let me just start off again. I'm sure I've probably got a lot of Trekkies in here, so I probably don't need to spend much time on this, but just a couple of quick things to kind of set up before I talk about some of these themes. Now, of course, Roddenberry pitched this series back in 1964 to network officials at NBC. The original Cage, the Cage was the pilot, but it was rejected. It was considered too cerebral. You remember that one with Jeffrey Hunter and the struggles there he had with the thought control of the other aliens. And so, unheard of, however, they asked him to make a second pilot. So he chose to do so, and they accepted that. They wanted something a little bit more swashbuckling. They wanted a little more action. And so Roddenberry had to tweak the show a little bit to fit the needs of the network. Now, again, in order to help the network understand it, Roddenberry, of course, had been cut his teeth in writing westerns for many years. And westerns were really the most dominant genre on television in the late 50s and early 60s. And so he kind of described it as the wagon train to the stars, a starship that's going to fly around space, encountering new civilizations, much like a wagon train would stop from place to place or city to city. And this is something that they could wrap their heads around and quite clearly understand. Now, one thing about Star Trek, it has a rich database, and particularly for me to use and for other scholars. More than 700 hours of single episodes, hour-long episodes, over the 5 series. That doesn't count about 22 or 23 hours from the animated series. Obviously now we're in our 12th movie coming out, Star Trek Into Darkness, as it has now been named. Hundreds and hundreds of books, probably more than 1,000 by now. I actually use some of them in my class because the novels allow you to kind of explore certain things, still using the approach that Star Trek offers, and in which maybe an episode couldn't necessarily do. Now, of course, Star Trek is a cultural phenomenon. I don't think I have to tell you that. Everybody in this room, and anybody you run into in this country, probably knows who Captain Kirk is, Mr. Spock. You know, they can say, "Beam me up." The whole, you know, if they're a little more sophisticated, they know engage and make it so. But I think one example of way of understanding how deep it's embedded in our culture is the number of parodies that have been done on Star Trek, which tells you a lot. Obviously, that is an acknowledgement of its significance, that people would understand these parodies, because if they don't understand it, it's not going to make a lot of sense. So this is as far back as the 70s, of course, Saturday Night Live, in living colors. If you've never seen the Wrath of Farrakhan clip on YouTube, it is hilarious. And again, of course, the over dramatic acting that they have to have Captain Kirk do, like William Shatner pulled off in Simpsons, Wonder Years, and of course now the Big Bang Theory really is home to much of this. So I thought I'd start off with one, since of course this is a comic book convention, and we know that Sheldon and others love comic books, and that's their home away from home. This, of course, is him and Raj talking about how to figure out something.
Oh look, Saturn 3 is on. I don't want to watch Saturn 3. Deep Space Nine is better.
How is Deep Space Nine better than Saturn 3?
Simple subtraction will tell you it's 6 better. Compromise, watch Babylon 5.
In what sense is that a compromise?
Well, 5 is partway between 3 and... Never mind. I'll tell you what, how about we go rock, paper, scissors?
Ew, I don't think so. Anecdotal evidence suggests that in a game of rock, paper, scissors, players familiar with each other will tie 75 to 80% of the time due to the limited number of outcomes. I suggest rock, paper, scissors, lizard, sock. It's very simple. But scissors cuts paper, paper covers rock, rock crushes lizard, lizard poisons Spock. Spock smashes scissors, scissors decapitates lizard, lizard eats paper, paper disproves Spock, Spock vaporizes rock, and as it always has, rock crushes scissors.
Okay, I think I got it.
Rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock.
And of course, you can't go almost any week without having some kind of reference to Star Trek. In fact, I believe I had a student of mine who went up and watched the taping of the November 8th show, which is all about Star Trek, coming up in a couple of weeks. Of course, another way of seeing the impact of Star Trek, of course, if those of you may remember the Christie's auction 5 or 6 years ago. 2006, Christie's Auction House, of course famous for auctioning off world artwork and jewels and things like that, had a special day on Star Trek. It was streamed live on historychannel.com, and people were floored by the bids that they got, including $500,000 for the next generation model ship of the Enterprise. There were all kinds of the famous flute that Captain Picard plays, which in fact doesn't play at all, he said. It doesn't work, doesn't make any sound. Went for like $50,000. They took in more than 8 or 9 million, I think, when it all came said and done, which again showed you the real attraction, particularly fans have had with Star Trek. And of course, conventions have kept Star Trek alive even during its down years in the 70s. Right now, in fact, they're meeting in London. The 5 captains appeared yesterday together. In London, I got to see 4 of them only in Vegas the last month. You have webisodes, and this is one of the very interesting things, several different fan-based creations of full-length episodes. And actually the quality, of course, compared to the 60s is much better. I mean, even the acting probably is about equivalent in some ways. But these have used Walter Koenig and George Takei and others, Denise Crosby, as some of the actors in some of these things. And they're well done. They take 6 or 9 months to put together. But you go to Star Trek Phase 2, I think Star Trek Hidden Frontier, these are 2 of the big groups that are doing this, spending their own money to put these productions on. And then of course you have the exhibitions, Star Trek The Exhibition, which started here in San Diego, I think it's right now in Florida, which allows you, as my wife and I did, to go sit on the bridge of the original series, get your picture taken, see props, memorabilia. They recreate the famous hallway in the Next Generation that you would see with the lighted panels that you can go up and kind of touch and play with. So again, in a variety of ways, of course, Star Trek has remained quite relevant beyond just the television series. Now, real quickly, I wanted to do is just kind of trace the series. I probably should have figured that most people would be very confident to understand what's going on here, but the original series, of course, began in 1966, 46 years ago. And again, it confronted 60s America. Of course, the United States was in the midst of a lot of turmoil. We have, of course, this is about the time of the peaking of the Vietnam War, 66 through 68. Race riots in Watts and Newark, Detroit. The counterculture in San Francisco, of course, was blossoming and challenging the norms of America. Feminism was beginning to emerge. And there was a lot of chaos and a sense of disorder and growing pessimism as the war in Vietnam continued to rage. And of course, Star Trek was able to deal with these kind of topics, deal with issues of race and war, religion and technology. And Roddenberry saw his science fiction show as a vehicle to do so. And I have a little quote from him. He says, "I have no belief that Star Trek depicts the actual future. It depicts us now. I don't ask that every program on the air be an exercise in reality, but I'd like to see other shows do more, to talk about what we are, where we should be going, and what we lack. It troubles me that there are no programs on television, at least none that I have seen, that point out to the world as operating in a very primitive way on a basis of hate. If we're ever to turn the corner away from that, we need our artists and poets and entertainers pointed it out. So again, he saw the show as a way to do more than just entertain. And again, the science fiction genre gave him what Oliver North, of course, called plausible deniability, which is the networks were very harsh back then, and they don't want to see shows dealing with these kinds of topics. So if you can pitch it as a futuristic show set with the other aliens, you can deny that this is about the war or in Vietnam or about race in America. It's actually about these aliens chasing each other across the ship or something. Now, of course, it offered a very optimistic future, which a lot of people really found attractive in the late 60s. That there was hope for humanity, that it would get past all its problems. Now, of course, as a television show, it was a miserable failure, which is the irony here. Ratings-wise, it was nearly canceled after the first year. The writing campaign kept it alive. The second year, they wanted to do it again. Writing campaign kept it alive. And finally, I think the third year, it was left at 10 o'clock on a Friday night, which is pretty, in today's world, we put it on Saturday night, when nobody all the reruns are on and nobody watches television, and it was left to die there. Now this lower slide here basically just gives you a sense of the chronology of the shows, the 5 series plus the animated series. Now, obviously between 1969 when it went off the air and toward the present, there were opportunities to engage with Star Trek a little bit. Of course, you had the reruns. Became one of the most popular shows to put on reruns, an hour-long episodes that you didn't need, it wasn't serialized, so you didn't need to know the storyline. Each episode was largely separated in its own. This is how, of course, I came onto it, coming home from school, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and flipping on the television and sitting in the easy chair so I could rock it like Captain Kirk did when the ship wasn't being blasted around. In 1973, you had the animated series, a 2-year effort, using all the actors. And some of the writers from the original show, writing some of those cartoons in essence. And then of course, in 1979, due to the success of Star Wars, Gene Roddenberry was asked to put together a movie, bring back the original crew, and of course brought us Star Trek the Motion Picture, which if you've ever watched Big Bang Theory, Sheldon is not a big fan of. It is, of course, has that famous scene of the ship slowly moving for like 12 minutes or something like that. They were just in love with their ship. And of course, it's continued on. J.J. Abrams, of course, picked up in 2009, and now we're waiting for the storyline. He's done a really good job of hiding what the storyline is in Star Trek Into Darkness. We just know the title. Now, of course, by the mid-'80s, television was changing. And of course, with the advent of cable, you now have new opportunities for broadcasting. You didn't have to just worry about the 3 or 4 major networks. And now this provided an opportunity for syndication efforts. And Roddenberry was asked to bring back a new show. And of course, he brought back a new crew in The Next Generation. And again, the new crew under, of course, the command of Captain Jean-Luc Picard, with William Riker as his first officer, Data the android. And again, it reinvigorated the franchise. It brought a whole new audience in, and to be honest, particularly for, let's say, those younger than the age of 30, this is the show that they know about. When I talk to my students, this is the one they all remember and learn Star Trek if they ever experienced it with this show. Many of them go back to the original series after that. And again, the first several years of the show continued to reflect some of the optimism and humanism of Gene Roddenberry. But he was ill in the first few years. He, of course, would die in '91. And as you can see a shift in the show itself. Freed from Roddenberry's hand, they began to explore things like religion through the Klingons, terrorism, which I'll talk a little bit about in a couple of minutes here. And again, it was increasingly shaped by the ending Cold War. Of course, having a Klingon on your crew, of course the Klingons equivalent to, of course, the Russians, the mortal enemy, this allowed them in many ways to, of course, if anybody remembers the episode Errand of Mercy, where the Organians tell the Klingons and Captain Kirk that one day they will be friends and allies. This allowed them to begin that process of kind of bringing them together. Now, the success, of course, of Next Generation spawned a host of other ones. Of course, the most controversial at that time, of course, was Deep Space Nine. Personally, my favorite of all of them. But Deep Space Nine, of course, was very different. and it was, so for some Trekkies it was too different. First of all, you weren't flying around from place to place, meeting new aliens. You were centered in one place the whole time, for the most part. In fact, it's not until like season 3 that he actually gets his own ship, that he can actually move off the space station. And again, it's a space station where it's in a deep area of conflict, far from the reaches of the Federation. And they're there, the Federation is there to act as almost like NATO forces in some ways, trying to mediate this ending dispute between the Cardassians and the Bajorans. The Bajorans have been occupied by the Cardassians for more than 50 years. And of course, it also recognized a new captain, the first African-American captain on the series that we see. But of course, it was a very darker, more or less optimistic view. And some of the writers, of course, relished this part of it because it did offer an opportunity to explore some of the darker things, and that everything is not going to end in a happy note. Of course, then Voyager came on a couple of years later, returned to the old style of a ship moving around and coming in contact and encountering new peoples. Of course, the difference here is they are catapulted into the Delta Quadrant, 70,000 light years away, and part of the premise of the underlying story is this journey home. A journey home where you don't have contact with your Federation, with the Federation or the homeland for at least several of the seasons. And one of the themes early on is not only the ability to integrate these two crews, the Maquis, we'll talk about a little bit later, and the Federation crew, but also Janeway's concern about maintaining Starfleet and Federation values in a world where if you decide to maybe ignore those values, you might get home quicker. You make this deal, but she will hold true to those values as much as she can. It had, of course, one of the most diverse crews, with Captain Janeway as a female captain. And of course, they brought on Jerry Ryan as 7 of 9, probably sexed it up a little bit, but nevertheless, it was a very compelling storyline. It was all about humanity and what makes one human in that. And she's trying to rediscover her humanity after being aboard for so many years. And again, that's a constant theme we see through all, whether it's Spock and his issue, what is human and not, or the Doctor, or Data, very common theme. Well, finally, then we come to Star Trek Enterprise. In 2001, I already heard some people already. I actually like Star Trek Enterprise. It had its downtime, of course, but that season 4 was fantastic. I thought it was really right where they needed to go. But they, of course, now were free to do so because they knew we were going off the air. But it was a prequel, of course, set 100 years before Kirk and Spock are commanding the Enterprise there. And again, what's nice is we get to kind of learn about the technology. They've just developed transporters and nobody really quite trusts them. They're still developing their photon torpedoes through the series. But most importantly, it's the story behind the creation of the Federation. They had hoped to have, of course, 7 years to do this, and they had to basically compress everything in that last year. But to help bring the Federation to being with Jonathan Archer and giving his speech when the 5 planets come together in a coalition. Now, it went on the air right around the days of 9/11. And in fact, as I'll talk about in a few minutes here, they would deal with the issue of terrorism a little bit, actually a tremendous amount in season 3, or at the end of season 2. Because most of the storylines are already in production and that, so they couldn't really deal with it. And maybe the society wasn't ready for it. All right, so what I want to do is kind of talk about a couple of key examples of how we see Star Trek reflecting society at the time. And how it was offered the opportunity for the viewer to kind of explore these very sensitive and controversial issues. Now, of course, Star Trek, the original series, emerges, of course, in the midst of the Cold War. We have this the Vietnam War. By 1966, there are hundreds of thousands of troops on the ground. By 1967, 500,000 troops. It has spawned growing anti-war protests by 66 and 67. And in this world, of course, the Klingons become the kind of equivalent to the USSR, an aggressive, militaristic society, very imperialistic. And in several different episodes, they alluded to the Cold War, like an Errand of Mercy, as I mentioned. But one episode in which they really kind of forced the viewer to kind of consider the debate over the American role in Vietnam was in what was called a Private Little War. And I'll show you a few minutes scene here in a second. And in this particular episode, Captain Kirk has returned to this planet that he had surveyed it, kind of an anthropological study, like 15 years before, it was 13 years before, and he's discovered that when he left, this was a society that was just in its early development. Didn't even have really kind of weapons there and that. And all of a sudden he comes back, and one group, they've been divided into two camps, the hill people and the villagers. And one group has flintlocks, weapons, and they should not have been able to develop those yet. They didn't have the technological abilities. And quickly realizes that it's the Klingons that have armed this side of the two groups. And Kirk now is facing a dilemma. What does he do? His friend that he met 13 years ago is the leader of the other group who doesn't have weapons, or doesn't have the flintlocks. And so he's considering arming them. And here's what he and McCoy had this conversation. Notice the references to Vietnam they try to make here. It takes a second for this one to come up. You see the whole kind of debate that was going on in the country, of course, about the support of South Vietnam versus North Vietnam. So the Hill and the villagers, in essence, are those two sides, where the Klingons have armed, or the Russians and Chinese have armed one side, and now the United States is supporting and trying to contain, not necessarily defeat communism, because that was not the strategy of the United States at the time. All right, now, of course, one other big issue of the 60s was race. And when Star Trek came to the air, of course, the nation was in the midst of a lot of racial turmoil. First of all, you had the growing success of the civil rights movement, or the freedom struggle in the American South, Martin Luther King and others, achieving the Civil Rights Act, for example, in '64, and the Voting Rights Act in '65. But outside the South, there was growing unrest in places like Oakland and Harlem and Detroit, and a new movement emerging, inspired by, of course, Malcolm X, and that was the Black Power movement, and best exemplified by the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. It was formed in 1966, literally a couple of weeks after Star Trek took to the air. So, as Star Trek was broadcasting over the 3 years, issues of race were becoming central to our public discourse. Now, when it came to race, Roddenberry saw an opportunity here to address this, simply in the diversity of the cast, of course. You have an African-American female as a member of the crew, a bridge crew, an Asian American also on the crew. Later, you also, what's very interesting is to see not just the crew, but all the other people coming in and out of episodes, like Dr. Daystrom, the greatest scientist, perhaps, of his day. Daystrom Institute, of course, renamed after him, an African American. So these were ways in which the show, in a more subtle way at least, tried to suggest that equality and race would be the future, and racism would come to an end. Now, in Plato's Stepchildren, you had, of course, the very first interracial kiss on network television, as Captain Kirk and Uhura were forced to kiss by these telepathic beings. And what's interesting, in the American South, numerous cities banned this episode. They would not show it because of the interracial nature here. Now, a few weeks after, almost a little over a month after Martin Luther King was assassinated, they began the creation of a new episode, which would be shown in 1969. And that was perhaps their most famous episode dealing with race. Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. And of course, this episode dealt with two beings that the crew encounters. Beale chasing a guy named Lokai. They both have black-white faces. Lokai argues that he's an oppressed person, and they've been holding him up and his people in segregated areas. Again, lots of interesting references to the nation's past, references to slavery and the master race. And the crew, of course, can't figure this out because they don't understand racism. It doesn't exist in their minds. And they don't understand why they don't like each other until Beale explains to Kirk in this particular scene, which is not subtle, but at least even if they don't. So again, the idea that the black and white faces are reversed, and of course to the crew and even to the audience probably didn't pick up on that initially. But again, it kind of denotes the idea that somehow skin color is an indication of such important difference. And here, the crew doesn't really see the difference. And again, also a reference near the end that you all come from one being at one point. You are of all the same ancestry. You share the same ancestry. Now, as we move forward, of course, toward the latter part of the 20th century, of course, Star Trek returns to the air by 1987, and of course, America's changed dramatically. Whether it's Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, or even Enterprise, they all begin to explore some of the same basic issues. These are primary issues that we all deal with: religion and war and politics and gender and sexuality. Well, religion was one of the very interesting ones, of course, because Gene Roddenberry was basically admitted atheist, a secular humanist, and anybody who's watched the original series knows anytime he does a religion, it's basically to denigrate it, not denigrate it, at least kind of reject it. In fact, even in the early Next Generation, there was an episode of this one here, Who Watches the Watchers, where Picard calls it a superstition religion. You know, that it's something that just people use to understand things that they can't figure out. Now, what's happened, of course, is by the 80s and 90s, America's changed dramatically. We have the evangelical Christianity movement, or the born-again Christian movement of the 70s, that becomes much more politicized than ever before. Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority begins to organize this movement into a political structure and a political movement that is trying to blur, in some ways, the separation between church and state as it was understood at the time. They had, of course, Ronald Reagan by the 80s. He was great friends with the religious right, despite the fact here's a guy who never basically went to church in his life, it looks like. But he spoke their language. He seemed to empathize with them. Now, as I said, the Next Generation, at least initially, continued that same attitude about religion. But it changed after Roddenberry's death. For example, you began to see religion explored into Klingons' faith in great detail. The episode with Kalis, and Worf has a crisis of faith, and he doesn't know whether he's lost his faith. But of course, Deep Space Nine would be steeped with religion. The Bajorans, a very religious society, who believe in these prophets, which others, outsiders like Federation, believe are wormhole aliens. And we find out that as Benjamin Sisko, the new commander in charge of Deep Space Nine, discovers that he is the emissary in their minds, this special, almost like prophet who's helping them, the wormhole prophets, direct and help Bajor. Now, in 1993, they had an episode that dealt with the issue of teaching of evolution, in a sense, in the schools, or at least teaching of religion in the schools in this case, which was a big issue in the 1980s and 90s. Great debates across our country over creation science and whether that should be taught equally to the Darwin's theories. So this particular scene, Keiko, Miles O'Brien's wife, is teaching about the wormhole and as a science, in a science way, and Kai Wynn, who is a up-and-coming religious leader trying to create a more power and influence in her society, begins to challenge her on this. For some reason, this particular clip, Keiko sounds like she has a speech impediment, but we'll just let that go. So. And, Captain Sisko intercedes to try to figure out how to bring some kind of compromise here. And again, what you begin to learn in there is not just this issue over what's taught in the schools is being used by the Kai as a way to empower herself. And again, part of the overall message here, again, is the idea of this danger, at least as seen, of that blurring of religion and politics. As Bajor is basically a theocracy where the religious leaders rule and have a lot of sway, and they can misuse this power too by using, and she actually convinces a young girl to almost commit suicide as an effort to help make her point by blowing up, by killing one of her competing Kais. Now, the issue of religion also came up a couple of times in some ways, particularly through the Vulcans in Enterprise. But in one episode called Chosen Realm, I'll just show you the trailer for it. This one is something most people, as you see it here, could be quite familiar with because of the way they handled religion here. They encounter believe that Enterprise has desecrated these spheres. These are sacred objects to them. But again, they want to get control of the Enterprise so they can go after heretics in their own society who don't abide. And again, you notice the guy blowing himself up would be like the suicide bomber that people would be familiar with watching the news in the Middle East. Islamic extremists who would use that kind of method to get their way. So again, this is a way in which Star Trek could ask the audience to kind of begin to look at some of these things. Well, one other major theme I want to talk about, and we'll talk about just a couple of other examples, was terrorism. Because terrorism became more and more, of course, prevalent to the American public in the 80s and 90s. Evident by, of course, just a sampling of things like the Marine Barracks bombing in 1983, the downing of Pan Am Flight 103. Now, those, of course, in the 80s, much of the terrorism was overseas. Americans may have been targeted, but they were targeted overseas. Here, beginning in 1993, we begin to see more attacks on the homeland. 1993, the first World Trade Center attack. 1995, domestic terrorism, which I'll talk about in a second here, with the Oklahoma City bombing, and of course, September 11th. Now, the Next Generation was really the first to kind of deal with terrorism in a fairly simplistic way initially. In the episode The High Ground, Beverly is kidnapped on this planet. That the Federation there and the Enterprise is there to help provide medical supplies and other kind of supplies. And she's captured by a man who's leader of an independence movement. And he is perceived as a terrorist. And he has a couple of very interesting conversations. And one of them here, he's explaining, again, who is a terrorist? Who gets to define, in a sense, who is a terrorist and who is not? It often depends on your perspective. And again, they're asking the audience to say, look, you have to understand that terrorists believe they have a cause. Whether you believe it or not, that doesn't necessarily is important, but you have to understand that they do. So here he compares, of course, himself to George Washington. There again, the Federation doesn't really understand this issue of terrorism, and again, because it's something distant and not, they have, by 1990, the United States has not yet fully experienced on its own soil. Now here's a quick discussion between Data and Picard over the usefulness of terrorism as a political weapon. Now again, there's this sense in this episode, again this was modeled after Northern Ireland, even Finn looks like he's an Irish guy too. Now, by the mid-90s, Deep Space Nine, of course, would be the center of a lot of terrorism episodes. The Bajorans, under Major Kira, admittedly used terrorism against the Cardassians. But what's interesting is you start to see the homegrown terrorists within the Federation, the Maquis, who in many ways, if you think about the 1990s, this is the time of the right-wing militias operating in the Pacific Northwest, the Badlands of the West. And of course, that's what they refer to the region they're inhabiting in the Federation. And they have, in the storyline, their homelands, their home planets, have now been turned over to the Cardassians, and they refuse to leave, and they're now using terrorism as a way to strike back at the Cardassians in order to hold on to their land. And we see this in a series of episodes that can come back to the Maquis. And finally, of course, after 2001, as I mentioned, Enterprise would have their own storyline, actually a year-long storyline, dealing with the issue of terrorism. In the episode The Expanse, it was the finale of season 2, this weapon, this test weapon by a group called the Xindi, attacks Earth with this force, drawing this straight line, killing millions from Florida, Venezuela. Archer's called back, and he offers to go out to the Xindi homeland. The Xindi basically believe that Earth is going to lead to their destruction down the line, and it's a preemptive strike then. We're going to knock off Earth before they can knock us off in 400 years, because they've been told by time travelers. So he's going to go to their homeland and take the fight to them. And again, this is very similar, of course, to the issue of Al-Qaeda in the United States. The war will be fought in Afghanistan, a mysterious place that seemingly nobody really understood. And the war will be taken to them to defeat them on their territory before they can strike Earth or the United States ever again. Now finally then, Star Trek also deals with some interesting social issues. One of those is genetic engineering, which goes all the way back to even in the earliest days of genetic engineering as a science. Of course, the original series brought us one of the greatest bad guys of all time. We're celebrating the 30th anniversary of his movie and the 45th anniversary, I believe it is, or something of his first episode, and of course that was Khan, a product of these eugenic wars of the 1990s, where the genetic manipulationer has enhanced his abilities, but not only his intelligence and his strength, but also the negative qualities, ambition, ruthlessness, they go hand in hand. And of course, he and Kirk confront each other. Eventually Kirk exiles him to a land, and of course he comes back from that in the movie. Well, genetic engineering would come back and forth in several different episodes in The Next Generation, but Deep Space Nine, it was central to that. And Dr. Bashir, I presume, we find out that Dr. Bashir was a product of genetic enhancement when he was a youth. And Mr. Diggs here helped write that episode, or excerpt. So in a few seconds, I hope you guys want to ask some questions about it. It's actually one of my favorites, because Yashir was one of those characters that was kind of never really developed well until later, until this point, and when he became rich. He was always having fun in the holodeck with Miles, but he became when we heard about his genetic background and that, and then of course it allowed him to bring all the augments, whatever they were called at the time, that he would deal with. Voyager had an episode about what was basically the idea of designer babies, if you want to call it. In the 90s, the possibility of parents being able to manipulate genetically the outcome of their child while in fetus was considered a possibility. And there was talk about making sure your child had blue eyes or this color hair or whatever, even the sex. Well, in Lineage and Voyager, Torres and they have Klingon and Paris are having a baby, and Torres and Paris discover, because the doctor's able to kind of extrapolate from the baby's fetus now what the baby will look like, and of course it's to be born with these heavy forehead ridges that all Klingons have, and Torres is horrified. And why would she be? She's a Klingon. And you discover over the rest of the episode is that she was, of course, a young Klingon girl living among humans, constantly felt ridiculed, teased, uncomfortable, and she believes this Klingon background was the reason why her and her father are so estranged. And eventually she lost contact and died, and she felt guilty about this. And so she didn't want her daughter to go through the same thing. So she tries to force the doctor, by changing his programming, to do this. So again, it forces the people watching this to kind of consider why people would want to do this and what are the downsides. And finally, then the last two and I'll show you a clip from the torture one here. In 2003, Enterprise, as part of a UPN network requirement, had an AIDS episode. Every show on UPN that year was supposed to have kind of an AIDS themed show. Now, how do you do that in Star Trek? And it's said, a couple hundred years in the past, you don't have AIDS, you would hope. But in Stigma, they do a very good job of this. And here it's T'Pol, the Vulcan, contracts Pinar syndrome, which is considered a dangerous, kind of a bad syndrome to have among Vulcans. But the way she gets it, of course, is through the mind meld, which this is 100 years before Spock. The mind meld, according to Vulcans, at least leaders, is considered a perverse action, an activity. It's an act of intimacy that is considered perverse, and so the Vulcans are very intolerant about those who contract Pinar syndrome. And she's contracted it accidentally by force of somebody's forced a mind meld on her. But again, as you hear the language in that, you can hear the language of those attacking homosexuality in the 90s, in the turn of the century, and AIDS victims. Well, finally here, because we have a few minutes to talk, there, of course, torture was another issue. And one of the great episodes in Next Generation, of course, was the torture of Jean-Luc Picard by the Cardassians. Picard is captured by a Cardassian, was addressing the issue of torture, and Patrick Stewart actually was a supporter of that. And again, you see how, because this guy's a tortured guy, he also gets taken up with the Borg at one point in the series. All right, well, that again gives you a sense of how we can see the Star Trek and its relation to history. I did want to give Biggs an opportunity, because I didn't know that he had helped write the Dr. Bashir episode, which was one of my favorites. So, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about how you saw this episode.
At the time that I pitched this story,
Come on,
well, the time that I pitched the story, my stepdaughter was severely dyslexic, and we had just found that out. And sure, despite everything we were doing, she was falling in her grades and everything. And so the question became, if as a loving parent I could change her, do something that would solve the problems that she was having, so that she would, because she was at the time, she was getting very frustrated. And if you love your child, you don't want to see your child suffer. Wow. I had thought about this for a long time. So the question was, would I change her? And obviously I would, but then having changed her so that she would become a more realized person, more intelligent person, would she then be able to question the decision and say, what was the matter, Daddy? Wasn't I good enough for you the way I was? And that was the whole reason of trying to explore what was going on with Julian Bashir's folks, who were faced with the same problem. genetic engineering was outlawed because of the whole situation with Khan Noonien Singh. But they were desperate parents, and they needed to have the same answer. And would you break the law for your child? And the way I answered it was, yeah, I would, regardless of the consequences. And finally, the father at the end of the episode, he ends up having to go to jail basically for what he did. And I thought, yeah, price well paid. So that was the genesis behind that episode.
Wow.
So, do you have any comments or questions you want to throw out? We got a few minutes here still. Yeah.
Is there